Now, joining us via Skype is country focal person on climate and resilient sustainable agriculture at ActionAid, Paul Benado. Welcome, sir.
Thank you so much.
Right, thank you very much for joining us. We'll also be speaking very soon to the Deputy Minister in charge of Employment and Labour Relations, Wereko Brobbey. Now, Mr. Benado, to begin with, you have been working with persons who are classified as poor, this quarter of Ghana's population as we know them. Share with us some of your experiences from your field work coming into contact with these people.
Yes, thank you very much. Let me also use this opportunity to celebrate rural women, as 15th of October last Sunday was celebrated for, it was dedicated to the celebration of rural women worldwide. And then yesterday was World Food Day. Today we are discussing poverty, International Day for the Eradication of Poverty. In the work of ActionAid, with the regions that we work with and the people that we work with, it is very clear that the incidence of poverty is highest among rural population, and that the fact is also established that the incidence of poverty is highest among households where the heirs are engaged as self-employed in the agricultural sector. This is clearly stated in the Ghana Living Standards Survey round 6, and it is not too different from what we experience in our engagements in communities. It's true that poverty levels are quite high in the rural communities. We try to understand in our work what is contributing to this high incidence of poverty among rural community through various activities, various participatory rural appraisal tools and analysis. It is very clear that it largely has to do with inequality and equal distribution of resources. So we said that a lot of the people who are engaged in agriculture are poor or live in poverty. We want to understand, why should people who are involved in agriculture, who make a living out of agriculture, whose economy is fixed on agriculture, are not getting the needed support or investment in that area? And so as long as you continue not to invest very well in agriculture, where the rural population make their livelihood from, then what you are essentially doing is widening the gap between the poor and then the rich. And so it has largely to do with unequal distribution of resources. It has to do with deprivation at the rural communities in terms of social amenities, in terms of amenities such as road network, poor road networks, and you know them. Poverty levels are high in rural communities also because educational standards are the least you can find in rural communities. And across all the sectors, there are also some sociocultural factors that have been known to contribute to poverty levels in rural communities. There is a particular concept that has not seen discourse in national level. We know all other challenges that contribute to poverty levels in rural communities. We've also gotten to understand that the issue of unpaid care work burden placed on women by sociocultural factors, our patriarchal orientation and constructs, social constructs, are those that largely place women in the rural community. Also, forest that you find when you engage with the communities.
So Mr. Benado, you are making the point that it is important
for analyzing the issues around gender and women.
Right. It's becoming a bit difficult for Mr. Benado to hear me, but he was there making a point about, when his line was breaking up, about how women and children are among the most disadvantaged. And of course, the information we have from UNICEF corroborates this, because children are 40% more likely to be poor than adults. Like I said, I have with me in the studio Mr. Wereko Brobbey. He's the Deputy Minister in charge of Employment and Labour Relations. Thank you very much for your time. Now, being one of the focal persons in charge of employment, you would understand that when it comes to issues of poverty, you are very involved. But you also have experience in civil society. Would you agree with these sentiments being put out by Mr. Benado, that is an issue of distribution of resources, deprivation, and lack of focus on issues like education and agriculture that is causing this?
Absolutely, yes. But let me say good morning to our viewers and also wish everybody coming on board to celebrate with us the World Day Against Poverty. It's an issue, and thank God it was brought out by one renowned Reverend Father. He saw this, that the world must come and act. So way back in 1987, he decided to discuss this. And 5 years later, the world adopted this day in 1992. So we are kind of celebrating the 25th anniversary of such an important day in our society. It gives us opportunity to reflect on the poor who live with us anyway, and then also to try and see how we can get them out of the doldrums of poverty. Listening to my friend, I clearly agree with him on the factors that he mentioned that keep people in poverty. But it is not to keep them in perpetuity in that state. As a country, and in fact as one of the countries of the world, we need to put in place interventions to stop these kinds of things, because you and I know, as you drive past Accra, you see lots of poverty. But then if you drive through the rural areas, they become more imminent. And so we have to all look at it and address them as such.
In the spirit of looking at it to put interventions in place, what do you make of this issue of inequality, where right now the gap between the rich and the poor is the widest? For instance, in a large organization, if you look at the salaries that some level categories of workers earn contain to the top brass of that organization, it's very wide. What can be done?
Yes. Statistics before us indicate that there's a wide disparity. The gap between the poor and the rich keeps on widening. It is something that needs to be addressed. I will lay it on the doorstep of primarily attitudes and behaviors. As a development specialist, workers' attitudes is one thing, if you are talking of productivity, that we should discuss. If we look at the issue of disparity holistically, there are certain factors that have brought these to bear. For example, levels of education, which we cannot do anything about, because when we are even looking for employment and so on, you are asked to bring your credentials. That first and foremost determines where we place you, and the salaries will go to a large extent to determine who you become. So by and large, I think that we have to try and bridge the gap using education, and for which, for me, Ghana is one of the countries that is doing very well to ensure that people leave the system where education is not given to them, and everything is being put in place to get everybody on board to be educated. So I think we have to look at it in terms of some of these things which will bridge the gap, even salary gaps, you know, between people who work in industry and people who are also working in offices and so on. If we get the gap closed by way of people getting more access to education, I think by and large we can bridge these kinds of gaps.
The questions have also been raised about taxation. Are the rich paying their fair share in taxes compared to, so that the money can be raised for the poor?
I must bring to your attention that currently as we speak, about 96% of the workforce in Ghana are in the informal sector. Those who are working in the government sector and are paying taxes, and even the private sector and also paying tax, people like you don't work in the government sector, but obviously you are in the formal sector and you contribute to taxes. If you have a situation where we have that big workforce in the informal sector, they are not captured in any way. It becomes very difficult for us to even locate them and even find them to pay taxes and contribute, you know, their due. So it's one thing that we should also be looking at. Thank God tomorrow, 18th, the Vice President, the President will all help us in launching the digitization and addressing systems. These are all steps to formalizing the economy. When we get people identified, then you can pinpoint people. They can have access to credit. They can go to the bank. They are no more the people you used to know because you can identify them. They have addresses and all that. So I think by and large, we can also get there.
Right. Let me bring in Mr. Bernardo there. The Honorable Wereko Brobbey seems to believe that the main solution is with education and with formalizing the economy so that we can widen the tax net. Do you agree that this is the best way that the poor must be supported?
I think Honorable has made such important points. Nobody can rule out the fact that education is very important when it comes to trying to address issues of poverty. But it's also important to really understand who are the poor we are talking about. We have said that from data available to us, that majority of the people who live below the poverty line reside in rural communities that, according to the Ghana Living Standards Survey, round 6, it also says that people who are engaged in agriculture are among the poorest. And so if you understand these dynamics, then it's important to now begin to know if that is it. How are we going to be able to work with such people to bring them out of that poverty line, to be able to begin to break the gap? That is what we should be looking at. And so agriculture cannot be ruled out because this is what they know, this is what they do. Their economies rely so much on agriculture, as we know, in the rural communities. And so for intervention to be able to break that gap, we should be able to take the right steps. And in that, we're talking about investing adequately in agriculture because the poor people are engaged in agriculture. If they are able to improve their lives through agriculture, then they can afford to send their children to the best of schools. We are talking about people who live in rural communities. What type of education do we have in those rural communities? Honorable, who is speaking, I believe that his children are in private schools. I believe maybe some of his children may even be studying abroad. So if the people who are poor, who are engaged in agriculture, we can invest adequately in agriculture and invest appropriately, and they're able to improve their lives, then they can also afford to take better care of their children's education, and that can break that chain of poverty that we are all affected. So for me, I think agriculture is key, and not just allocating adequate resources, but also appropriately, considering gender considerations. Because even in that, we have women who are engaged in agriculture. I mean, data available again tells us we have many more women engaged in agriculture than men. So if we are turning out even investment in agriculture and we lose sight of the gender considerations, then we will still not succeed in bridging the gap. What we will end up doing is widening the poverty gap. So for me, I think that let's look at that. And even agriculture, we also need to look at what type of agriculture are we talking about. Agriculture that targets smallholder farmers, because they're the majority that farm to feed us. That type of agriculture that allows their participation. And that can only be sustainable agriculture, not the models we are pursuing now, conventional agriculture that depends so much on external inputs with the related cost that the smallholder farmers are not able to afford effectively.
Right.
Until recently that we have this huge subsidization in fertilizer, it was a hell. Even with this, there are so many women farmers who are not able even to afford that subsidized fertilizer. So we really need to take the right steps, invest appropriately, consider gender issues in our investment in agriculture, and promote more of sustainable agriculture than the current agricultural models like the conventional agriculture we are pursuing.
Let me bring it straight to the Deputy Minister, because agriculture seems to be a major agenda for this government, not just agriculture in terms of farming, but the entire value chain, looking at policies like one district, one factory. But have you considered all these factors, gender and making it more inclusive?
Yeah, I think that it becomes more imperative to think through that because of the 1.2 billion people living in extreme poverty. About 70% of them are women and girls. So if we want to discuss the issue of poverty and think of reducing it in terms of average, we need to target women and children and girls in particular. And for me, I think that we are trying to do a lot by way of gender inclusion, by way of trying to bring our women and children upstream. So, for example, if we target girls' education, which as part of what the interventions of the country. It's a whole unit within the Ghana Education Service trying to look at the education of girls in particular. This, for me, is one of the steps to bring them up. If they
is the creation of such an office enough? There was a time that there was a Ministry of State in charge of girl child education.
Yes, yes. It's, you know, all these interventions are parts of a whole. So once the office is set up, it begins to let you know that the consciousness is even there, you know, to start looking at that. But I must come home a bit to discuss the issues of poverty and how people even understand it. It is not just saying that people don't have money. That in fact, when you ask the ordinary man, what is poverty? He thinks if money is not in my pocket, it means I'm poor. No.
I had to get some education when I was preparing for this.
Absolutely. We have so many things that go into we saying that people are living in poverty, people living in extreme poverty, and so on and so forth. I must say that in terms of development, and as we look at it, we have underlying causes of poverty, the immediate and the intermediate. Many times we seem to look at the immediate causes, which are the needs. So we think somebody needs something, we need to provide, and we provide. But we need to go beyond that and look at intermediate and underlying causes. As we begin to tackle the underlying causes of poverty, then we will be solving the problems as and when they arise. So, for example, an immediate cause may be natural disasters. So we see people are drowned and we need to go there and save them. You save them, and what next? So you begin to feel that handouts are fine. But then poverty depends on the individual having capacity to raise him or herself out of the situation him or herself find that the
Which
person
is why,
is
for
living.
instance, Mr. Benado was pointing at looking at sectors like agriculture, where most people in these rural communities employ themselves in. And I'll come back to you in your final words for us to talk about that. But let me pick Mr. Benado's final thoughts on the issue. A conversation has gone on, sir, but in your view, how should we move this whole thing forward?
Well, I think that it's clear once we begin to understand those who are most affected, who are the poor people among us, then we are able to know how to better support this type of people to come up. And we talk about an issue of unequal distribution of resources. So are we prepared as a country to begin to adequately allocate resources to sectors that this type of people, the poor people, are engaged in, that they are able to come up? Are we prepared to allocate these resources appropriately, targeting very well? For me, these are the things to look at. And Honorable talk about the root causes, and I think that is key. As long as we don't address the root causes, then we may not be able to get there. We're talking about women, over 70% of them are the poor. I mentioned an issue earlier, the issue of women care burden, unpaid care work burden. The data we have indicate that women spend a lot of their time doing care work in the rural communities, care for children, looking for water, going to bush to get firewood, and all of those. They have very little time to really engage, even when you roll out some of these programs, because of the social contract of the fact that they are responsible for a lot of the care work. And so if we cannot look at these issues and put in place appropriate interventions to reduce women unpaid care work burden, so they have much more time to engage in agriculture, to engage in other economic activities, then other program interventions may not succeed. So that is a matter of a root issue that has to be dealt with. And we're also talking about resource allocation, investing appropriately in agriculture, because that is where they make their livelihoods. So these are the root issues. As long as we don't do that, we could not roll out some programs like maybe LEAD, for example, to give people some handouts every month or every 2 months. It's not going to address their issues of poverty. Nobody will want to get to a point where the person is being supported by LEAD. Normally, nobody will want to get to that point because it's not dignifying. Honorable, will not want to get to a point where we are supported by such government programs. It's not dignifying. We want a situation where people can be able to make their own living. And so we create the enabling environment that enables them to be able to make their own living. so they are able to live dignified lives. So these are the root issues we need to look at and address them going forward in the case of bridging the poverty gap.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Bernardo, for those thoughts. Honorable, I'll come to you for your final words, particularly in what we are doing about this situation.
Yes, just before you left off with me, I was discussing the kinds of
the underlying factors.
Yes, the underlying factors. But I must stress that not only the underlying factors that are addressed that will get the kinds of people we perceive to be poor and how we deal with them also goes a long way to lift them out of poverty. For instance, we have sat in Accra and decided so many projects for the poor, thinking that as we do so for them, they will be better off. But we are forgetting to see that once these people are the ones we call poor, if they are brought into the picture and we reason with them, we discuss with them, we try to know why they are in that state, and the solutions to their problems largely comes from them. Sometimes we gloss over that and think that the powers that be must decide things for people living in poverty. So this is one thing that we must also realize, that we need to bring them on board, the participatory approaches to finding sustainable solutions.
And it points at the Infrastructure for Poverty Eradication Program, the 1 million one constituency. I remember this conversation was had around about allowing rural communities to decide.
Absolutely, and this is what is going on. I mean, people have been sent to the rural people to ask them, I mean, what do you think will make you come out of your situation? And they are giving fantastic ideas. They are telling you how, when you assist them to push them on a certain pedestal, they can move to the next step. So I think by and large, we must be looking at such interventions.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Bright Wereko Brobbey. We now cross over to the Flagstaff House. My colleague Latif Idris is standing by to tell us the latest as regards the visit of President Alassane Ouattara from La Côte d'Ivoire.
Addressing a news conference here at the Flagstaff House, and you can only get this live here on your most authoritative news channel, Joy News. We will be here when this joint news conference happens. Don't go away, stay with us.
So as you heard Latif say there will soon be a news conference organized to brief the public on the latest on the visits of the Ivorian presidents. Now, a world without journalists will be one in which powerful people easily take the law into their hands and eternally abuse the vulnerable. The Media Foundation for West Africa therefore presents the West Africa Media Excellence Conference and Awards to inspire media excellence across West Africa. The event comes off at the Mövenpick Ambassador Hotel on 28 October 2017 at 6:30 p.m. Get ready to celebrate excellence journalism in West Africa. And the West Africa Media Excellence Conference and Awards event is sponsored by Tullow Oil, MTN, the U.S. Embassy, Ghana Chamber of Bulk Oil Distributors, Stanbic Bank, and Mövenpick Ambassador Hotel. Media partners are Joy News, Class FM, Daily Guide newspaper, The Finder newspaper, and several West African media outlets.